This episode was brought to you by Nail It and Scale It, the world's leading fast growth program for business. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome to Unstoppable today, Ben Pronk. Ben is a specialist in risk, resilience, process improvement, and leadership in high-pressure situations. He is an ex-Special Forces operative with 24 years in the Australian Army and is also the co-founder of the Mettle Global, a consultancy that delivers resilience solutions to clients globally. He teaches leadership programs at the Australian School of Management and is also a board member for VGI Partners. He's served on multiple operational deployments to Timor-Leste, Iraq, Afghanistan, and was decorated for leadership and action. And he concluded his service as a commanding officer of the SAS. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ben Pronk. Ben, great to have you here, mate.
Kerwin, it's awesome to be here.
Whereabouts in the world are you? I forgot to ask.
I'm in the West Coast. I'm in Perth.
So you're in the land of the free.
Oh, yeah, but I'm not gobbing off about it, mate. Because that's a nasty thing to do. And you know, we are really sympathetic to people in the rest of Australia and the rest of the world who are dealing with far worse COVID situations than us. And B, because it's probably only a matter of time before it's us in that same boat.
Yeah, no kidding. They seem to be picking it off state by state. So I think the odds are on for Queensland next, followed by South Australia and possibly WA, but we'll see. But mate, I'm really curious because you have an extensive career, not just in military, but also now in the private sector. But if you were to go and sit down, for dinner with a group of 8 people who didn't know you, and the conversation turned quiet in the first 10 minutes, and someone turned to you as everybody looked and said, "So what do you do, Ben?" How do you answer that question?
Our elevator pitch is we promote organisational excellence. And this actually is something we've evolved to. I reckon a couple of years ago, we would have said in our current roles that we do crisis management and leadership and resilience. But the more we look at it, the more we see there's a nexus between all of these sorts of things. And our interest in resilience comes from our own sort of personal sort of backstories, but we are seeing a demand for it. We're seeing how it translates not only to betterment at an individual level, but also to groups of people and how it can sort of progress. And we reckon that, so many of these things are multifactorial. We want to be sort of continuously just assessing and sort of nudging different areas forward. And that's essentially how I describe what we do, promote that organisational excellence by sort of tweaking those levers.
It's been interesting to observe, the consultancy space over the last 20, 30 years and see the dynamics and the language change, because I know once upon a time, stress was a big thing, especially in the corporate space. And then it's kind of been phased out with an integration of performance training, and high performance training. And now we're seeing that oftentimes at the core of performance training is resilience training and grit training. But it's been a bit of an evolution. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, part of this mirrors our own interest in this concept of resilience, because we think, particularly back in the day, that the conversation was all about stress. We've got to reduce stress or manage our stress. And we sort of think of it as a seesaw with stress on one side and resilience on the other. And all the focus was on stress, which kind of didn't really prepare people left of an incident. It was all about, okay, we'll manage it until we have a spill and then we'll take some stress off. And so it's really cool to see that a lot more discussion is coming towards this idea of, well, how can we build that resilience side of the equation so that we don't ever get to that point where the scales tip negatively.
And like you said, there is a real nexus now. There are so many modalities that are coming together that are joining forces that really do help when it comes to the increase in performance. I am curious though, where does your journey in this space start? Because I know you joined the military, but is this where it started for you, or did you have an interest in performance before that?
I'm laughing because anyone who knew me at high school, I was the fat kid at high school.
No way.
An interest in performance probably.
So you didn't have any discipline in high school? You weren't a sports person or a mathematician a musician?
Really. I was definitely a musician, and I did pretty well at school, the academic side of things. So, I don't know if it was a lack of discipline, but certainly it's a funny sort of journey. My father, so my brother and I co-authored the book, obviously same dad, but we often reflect on how he and my mother instilled in us this concept that anything was doable, that, you know, if someone could do it, then you could do it. And so I think I always had that underpinning belief, and I think that's really set me up well for later ventures and challenges. But I don't think as an adolescent I really sort of manifested that. I don't think I backed myself to sort of follow some of those things through. And for me, I guess the real start of the journey was through the sort of exposure to the SAS concept. I think I'd read Bravo 20. That would have been about the time where I sort of first became aware of this thing. And it just seemed so far off. But with the benefit of hindsight, I think I did set up on this sort of 1 foot at a time type journey, which currently, you know, this virtuous circle gave me confidence. Each one of those little steps that I made towards this seemingly unattainable goal served as just a little platform that I was a bit higher up when I took the next challenge. And so to answer, long-winded way to answer your question, I think my journey did start when I sort of clicked out of that mode of you know, not challenging myself, and actually set this goal and, you know, tried to do a 5K run and failed, and then sort of gradually built that up to, you know, I remember a half marathon was a massive thing, and did that, and then sort of progressed from there. So that, I reckon, was the real start of the interest in the journey.
And so at what point did the military come onto your radar? Was it while you're at school? You started reading Bravo 20 and then that became an aspirational goal for you? Is your dad ex-military?
He is, yeah. So my father was an Army helicopter pilot.
Yeah, wow.
And so we'd always had this in the background. And, you know, back in the day, you'd go to these open days and they'd fly around in helicopters, and you could drive around in the back of APCs and shoot blanks. And I don't think that happens so much anymore. But we very much had this front row seat. And from day one, you know, I was the the fat kid in cams wanting to be a soldier sort of when I grew up. So that was always in the pipeline. And funnily, Dan, my brother, was completely the opposite. He never wanted to join the army as a kid. So I had that exposure, but not to that sort of SAS side. And like I said, it was those things like the external, you know, when it started coming on the collective consciousness through things like Bravo 20, that I think I really drifted, or my sort of sights aligned on that.
Yeah, right. And so what was the progression? You decided when you left school, did you just join the military and then you progressed towards the SAS?
Yeah, I applied for the Australian Defence Force Academy in my final year at school and got accepted. And I finished school at 17. So we collectively decided it was probably not a good idea to join the military and go to university younger than drinking age. So I had a year off and did this gap year actually with my father. We travelled all around Australia. We did a number of these amazing sort of expeditions. And it was a real... But my father passed a couple of years ago, and it's just such a cherished memory for me, and a beautiful transition from, you know, adolescence to manhood in that almost that older sense of the term. So that was fantastic, 100%. And then into the academy, did 3 years there, 4th year at the Royal Military College Duntroon, which is the Army officer training. And then at the end of that, decided to go to Infantry Corps. Did that for a couple of years up in Townsville, which was just fantastic.
The Laverick Barracks.
Laverick Barracks.
I was gonna throw that out there. I actually grew up on Laverick.
Oh, really?
Yeah, my best mate, his parents used to run the kiosk at the pool and the theatre there.
Awesome.
And I have so many great memories. Like you talk about, you know, sitting in the back of an APC and firing blanks. Like we used to walk around Laverick and find chains of M60 blank ammo. And we'd spend hours there with our pliers cutting the heads off and pouring out the powder. Yeah, and then lighting up the powder and lighting up the primers. And yeah, lots of good memories. Hilarious. And so you spent time up there?
Yeah, I did a couple of years up there. Gee, like so many things, you never appreciate it, I don't think, at the moment. But looking back, I mean, that was incredible soldiering. It was an amazing time too, because we'd had this sort of 30-year period since Vietnam where the Army just hadn't deployed.
Yeah.
And so there was kind of no expectation. I mean, my father had served and never deployed. And so there was no expectation that you'd go on operations or go to war. But all of a sudden, there was this kind of almost ground rush. Timor sort of started in my last year there, and I deployed on D-Day at the end of 1999 with the 2nd Battalion. and just it's very funny to look back on operational service, because there's a lot of people have negative experiences, and clearly there's a really well-deserved narrative about PTSD. But something that is often not spoken that sort of publicly about is it is exhilarating. It is a culmination of a sort of professional journey for many people. It is what you've been employed to do. I think, it sounds almost trite, but there is a nobility to serving your nation. And you can argue about the politics of whether we should have been in this country or that. But fundamentally, this idea of serving the democratically elected government of your nation and representing Australia's interests in that foreign context, all of those things are, I think, very worthwhile and very professionally fulfilling for most soldiers.
And so was it long after that you applied for the SAS and
went west? It was right after that. So
right.
I got back from East Timor, I think it would have been about February 2000. So,
yep.
And again, it's funny with hindsight, I remember Y2K was a big thing. I spent New Year's Eve on the Indonesian border on picket, and we actually watched the clock tick over from a gun position through night vision goggles. And we didn't, there was all those conspiracy. We were wondering, would the world stop? Would our night vision goggles suddenly cut out, or our radios blow up or something? And it was all incredibly anticlimactic. February 2000, I came back and got posted to the School of Infantry in Singleton in a supernumerary position. If ever there was an incentive to pass selection course, it is being posted supernumerary to the School of Infantry at Singleton.
Is that a shit job, is it?
It's just, the school's a fantastic job, but I had no job. I was just sort of floating around. And so the alternative, if I didn't pass, was to go back to kind of nothingness. And so it was a great driver. Within I think it was about 4 or 5 weeks from getting back to Timor, I did selection and fortunately did get through and then in the regiment from there.
And tell us about that, because oftentimes, SAS, and I've had the great privilege of, I haven't trained with SAS, but I have trained with Navy SEALs, Ukrainian Special Forces. But, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at a Navy SEAL or, British SAS or Australian SAS, there's oftentimes a lot of mystery surrounding, not so much the selection process, but the people. Oftentimes in photos, their faces are blacked out.
Yeah.
But there's a real, I guess you could say, high degree of, and we talk about rite of passage, but initiation that's required to be accepted into SAS. I know with the Navy SEALs, I'm a lot more familiar with their process. They have their BUDS training, which is culminated with Hell Week. And then if you manage to get through that, then you've qualified for the SQL training, and then there's more training before you get the opportunity to put into a team. Tell us about the arduous or the mental gymnastics that they put you through that help them identify who does have what it takes. Because this is where I find the science really interesting. And you probably know this better than anybody. It's more than 80% of people that apply for the SEALs, they will ding themselves out. And I know the US military, and this is going back maybe a decade or more ago, they went and thought, well, hang on, we're spending all these millions, if not billions of dollars over time, training 400 people at a time, but we're only putting 80 people through. Surely there's a way that we can profile these people to be able to identify the characteristics so that we're training less people and graduating more. And what I found really interesting is with all the psych profiles, they only came down to be able to identify one component that was categorically present in all of those 20%, which was grit. But then they had the trouble of, well, how do we measure that? Because they can't measure that, in a psychometric profile. So I'd love to know, how, the SAS essentially qualified you, and, what that was like when you're observing other people. Because I'm going to assume the failure rate for the SAS is going to be similar. Is it similar to the...
Yeah, it is. And there's variations on themes around the world in terms of selection processes, but often they're looking at the same principles. I mean, to answer that question, I do actually want to talk about, you mentioned the word initiation and sort of rite of passage.
Yes.
I think that's a really important component of this. So over and above the sort of mechanics of how people are selected and what we're looking for, which I'll talk to in a second, it is actually a very crucial step in terms of becoming a member of this social group.
Yeah.
And we
Very exclusive social group.
Yeah. And I think there's some really interesting aspects of that, I think if you look at things like social identity theory, where they talk about in-groups, and we've seen over history when they get exclusionary rather than exclusive, and they start really negatively comparing with other groups, that can breed a toxicity. But I think we tend to talk about things like rites of passage and initiation in a very pejorative sense these days, because we think of, frat house hazing and these sorts of juvenile versions of it. But I think there is something very important about having a common hardship that bonds a group together, a common sort of standard and understanding amongst people, particularly in occupations like special operations. And so there is a really an emblematic, a symbolic importance to the selection course. And of course, all of the courses end with some kind of artifact. The Navy SEALs get their tridents. We get a Sandy Beret at the end of all of it, which again talks about that sort of social group and the membership of that particular group of people. Yeah, that identification. But look, to answer your question, it's really interesting you're saying that everyone has been chasing that holy grail. We're burning all these people out. We're injuring a lot of people. Can we shortcut this by looking at either psych or physical characteristics that will predict success? And no one's been able to find it, because it does vary so differently. There are so many different types of people that get through this course that it is hard to sort of neck them down and profile. It's interesting you say grit was the one correlate. In our sort of experience, the only sort of psychological correlate, and it wasn't even a strong correlation, but the strongest of them was with locus of control. And so,
what was it?
This is locus of control.
Oh, I like that.
So the ability to feel that you've got a say in your destiny. Someone with a high internal locus of control, and this comes out in our resilience research as well.
Yeah, wow.
Feels like they can change the way things. They're not a victim. They're not completely at the whim of fate or mercy. So people are judged as to have either an internal or an external locus of control,
Gotcha.
And none of this is binary. But yep.
And so, we look at the work from Carol Dweck, and you're probably familiar with her work
growth mindset.
Around growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And the fixed mindset, is typically characterized by someone who doesn't believe they have the capacity to solve problems. And when they're given a problem, you look at their brain on an fMRI, it's pretty much dead. When you look at someone who's got the growth mindset, who's been given the same problem under an fMRI, their brain is lit up, making numerous connections trying to solve that problem, because there's a fundamental belief that they can. So when you say locus control, are we really talking about a growth mindset here, someone who feels like they have the power to change things?
Yes, I think there's a massive overlap, and we actually talk about that in the book. That understanding of Dweck's work was pretty profound for me, actually.
Me too.
Jumping forward, but I think I did have a fixed mindset, particularly around status. What people would think of me if I failed.
Yeah,
if I'm honest, that was a bit of a factor for me, and so that concept of having a growth mindset, seeing failure as an opportunity to learn, seeing obstacles as challenges, not threats. Definitely someone with a high internal locus of control is more predisposed to having that kind of mindset. And I mean, you mentioned grit and Angela Duckworth's work there. Mm-hmm. All of these things, I think, are overlapping Venn diagrams.
Yes.
We're seeing a lot of that grit as a subset of the personality trait of conscientiousness, that kind of perseverance that is buttressed by a perspective that you can control your destiny, you can change things. And all of this, I think, when you're looking at this concept of resilience, it's the antithesis of victimhood. You can, and we love the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius advises us to get active in your own rescue. All of this contributes to your feeling that you can get active in your own rescue, and with the things like the grit, the growth mindset, that you have the determination, the passion and perseverance to actually see that through.
So when we talk, because I think we've described locus of control, and we've got a pretty good understanding of the importance of what a growth mindset is and how that applies to this area. But I think sometimes people go, well, resilience, what is it? Grit, what is it? How do you define those terms?
Yeah, That it was a massive question for us, and really that was the question that started our journey, which ultimately led to this book. The catalyst for us was seeing some of our friends go through experiences, particularly deployed, traumatic experiences in Afghanistan, and have these markedly different responses. And on paper, we looked like the same human being. We were all physically fit. We clearly had some level of mental robustness because we'd got through these selection courses and this training and that sort of stuff. We'd all experienced the same traumas, and yet the reaction was different. And so this for us was a big thing. It must be more than just the physical fitness and the mental toughness. What were these other components? And so that set us on our journey, and particularly my brother Dan's experiences. He had a couple of bad tours and had some post-traumatic stress experiences after that. And so that got us on this journey to really understand what resilience was. And our model, the Resilience Shield, describes it being multifactorial, made up of a whole bunch of different things, dynamic. It needs to ebb and flow with your life, and it needs to change depending on circumstance and even the individual. And importantly, it's modifiable. You can get better at resilience. And so the 6 components that we call the layers of the Resilience Shield are innate. There is a nature, nurture, genetics, epigenetics thing to it.
Yeah.
Mind, which is massive, and this encompasses all of those things that give you that positive, what William Ernest Henley calls an unconquerable soul. So things like grit mindset, things like the sort of stoic perspectives that we're very attracted to. But also the mind layer includes our ability to flush the nonsense out. So practices like meditation, like mindfulness, like gratitude, these kind of things help us get rid of the distracting thoughts, which again sort of really support that positive mindset.
And just on that, because I think there'll be a couple of listeners going, so hang on a second, are you telling me that you train in SAS? Do SAS get trained to be mindful and meditate?
We didn't, and I wish we had, and I think the unit's getting better at it. And Kerwin, this is an awesome point, because I came late to mindfulness and meditation, and I came very cynically to mindfulness and meditation. Even now, a part of me, when I hear that word, before I catch myself, I think of, mung beans, orange flowing robes and incense candles. And it's anathema to that kind of martial warrior context that I was in. But I think this is a PR campaign, not a fundamental problem with the product.
Yeah.
Mindfulness, meditation, any of these focus type practices are just like going to the gym for your brain. And the research, the entry for me was seeing some of the research about neuroplasticity and the positive things that mindfulness training can do to your brain. In particular, things like laminating the pathways between your prefrontal cortex, your thinking brain, and your amygdala, which is your primal responsive brain. Essentially, what this is telling us is that mindfulness practice can, like I said, it's a gym training for your brain, but it allows us to put our thinking brain in the driver's seat for our stress response, or more in the driver's seat over our stress response, which to me is epic. Like, that is an incredible thing that we can be doing through this kind of training.
So number 2 is the mind. What's number 3?
Number 3 is the body. Yep. And I'm sort of jumping ahead. None of these are independent layers. Obviously, there is an interwoven aspect to them.
Yep.
But we're talking sleep, diet, and exercise here.
Yep.
Interestingly, that is a no-brainer. Everyone knows that those things are going to impact on your resilience and promote it. And yet, when we start getting stressed, what are the first 3 things that go? Sleep, diet, and exercise. And so, recognizing the importance of those. And some of the nuance to that. Sleep is really interesting. Our research shows that is MVP, most valuable player for the body layer, by a long shot. And some of the things that we do to compromise our sleep, things like blue light, things like often caffeine at the wrong time, certainly things like alcohol before sleep, can really have an impact on how that's helping us in a restorative sense.
It's interesting. I don't know if you've read Stephen Kotler's latest book, The Art of Impossible. You have?
I haven't. No. I'm familiar with Playing with Fire. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll absolutely love it. But it's interesting. He talks about the 6 or the 7 layers of grit. But one of the layers of grit that he talks about, which is one of the most important layers of grit, is he calls it the grit to recover. And he characterized it beautifully, because I think, this is a problem that not just, I think, military have, but I think this is everyday people, but especially high performers, entrepreneurs, executives, is we sometimes feel guilty when we take time off. Sometimes, I could meditate for 20 minutes, or I could write this brief. Well, this needs to be done. It's on a deadline. I'll just focus on that. Have you started to identify that there's a real discipline, there's a real grit, there's a real resilience that's actually required in order to be able to support the body and support the mind in order to prevent burnout, but also optimize performance?
Yes, there really is. And the paradox, I think, is that once you start becoming aware of that, and you find that 10, 20 minutes to meditate, and you find that little space to do the exercise, anecdotally, and certainly talking with a lot of people who've found this, that it actually builds more time into your day. You find that you can become more focused. We talk a lot about the overlap between the focus of things like mindfulness practices and meditation, and then being able to switch on to a job and actually, neck it down without constant distraction and constant chattering mind, which actually builds more time into your day. But your point's a really good one, Kerwin. This doesn't just happen. And the idea that I'll just find that 20 minutes somewhere in my day to do these things, it makes them discretionary, and so they get dropped off. And B, it kind of never happens. We've run out of time. So it does require, I like that idea of grit for recovery, that we need to be disciplined in building what we talk about, habits. Just bolt these little habits together, and it becomes a routine.
Where I really learned about this, I spent about almost 3 weeks in Ukraine. I had the great privilege of training with some of their special forces over there. And we were training in this incredible facility. It was probably one of the top private military facilities in Europe. But what I observed straight away is they said, okay, we're only going to be training for about, an hour and a half to 2 hours for the first few days. And then that's it. And I was like, what? I want to be training for like 6 or 7 hours. But then what I noticed, you'd train, and again, the first 3 days it was all dry fire weapons drilling, small arms and the AR. And what I noticed, after about an hour and a half, 2 hours, you're literally mentally exhausted to the point where they said, okay, so you've now reached the point of saturation or satiation, and you've now reached the point of diminishing returns. And if you keep going now, all you're going to be doing is practicing mistakes, practicing bad habits. And by about the 7th day, we were, into the live fire drills then. We were, doing dry fire drills as well for 2 hours, and another 2 hours of live fire drills. And what I noticed was the level of fatigue that was coming on. Yes, I was able to progress further and further and further. But what became really interesting is as soon as I started meditating in the breaks, my capacity to be able to keep going without losing performance was increased dramatically, to the point where I actually had the instructors coming over and going, what's going on? Like, why are you able to? It was really interesting. And I was like, fucking awesome. Surely these guys must be onto this. But it's the same in everyday life, right? We get to the point where we become satiated with stress, satiated with emotions, and we start making mistakes, but we don't take a break. We keep going. And oftentimes all we're doing is practicing making mistakes in the everyday work that we do. So how do we, if you're telling me, someone's listening going, fuck, I'm really shit at taking care of myself. Well, how do I take care? What's one thing I can do to develop a level of grit or discipline around taking care of myself? Like, what would you say to someone in that situation?
I reckon for me, the biggest thing is get it out of your head. Make it so it's not just your mind that's the only thing that's keeping you accountable for it. And that can even be as simple as making a commitment on a piece of paper. We love journaling. I think that's a really cool thing to do for a whole bunch of reasons. But if you can commit to it externally, that's the first step that can actually make this thing real and not something that's just in your head and you can throw out. Better yet still, if you can enroll someone into the practice, and if we get these beautiful overlaps between things like exercise and social, spending time with loved ones or friends, that gives you that external accountability as well. But even, if you don't have the luxury of that, or if we're in lockdown or whatever, even just that externalizing it by writing it down, that can make it real. And then remove the barriers. Things like laying out your exercise gear in the morning so that you don't have to go through that executive function of working out what to wear, and that can act as a barrier. things like, setting the alarm and actually having the meditation area set up, if that's what you want to do as the first part of your day. Things like using guided meditation apps. These are awesome tools that can just remove those little barriers to entry, those little things that may become the sticking points when you're actually going to do it. The easier you can make it on yourself, the more chance it's got of being sticky.
One of the things that I've observed that affects people's performance is fatigue, but specifically decision fatigue. So I'm going to assume, with the work that you've done, especially in the high risk, not just in military, but also in the civilian space, that you guys have worked out ways that you can manage fatigue, body fatigue, mental fatigue, and decision fatigue is a real fatigue. So how do you support people to prevent them from having to make too many decisions that can prevent them from operating and performing at a high level?
One of the for me personally, and what we teach a lot through our leadership and resilience practices, is a bit of an understanding about this idea of complexity. So there's a whole amazing school of academic research into complex adaptive systems theory, but in a nutshell, what it's telling us is we can't predict the future. And I think so much of what we do and so much of the pressure we put on ourselves and so much of the expectation that organizations put on leaders is this idea that you're supposed to come up with a plan that can predict the future. And this causes a lot of that issue with decisions. If we're able to reframe it with an understanding that we cannot predict, and indeed, as soon as we interact with the system, we're going to change that future anyway, it shifts our focus from having to come up with what a guy called Dave Snowden talks about, shifting from a fail-safe plan to a safe fail experiment. We shift our, I think it's really powerful that our decisions are not final. They're not the set in stone thing. They are a sort of decision based on what we know at this stage. But having that kind of mental model, A, means that we're not sort of setting this fire and forget sort of path. And B, it leaves us open to what the environment's actually feeding back to us. So it fights things like confirmation bias and groupthink. It keeps us more open to what's actually happening and allows us to adapt and go through, which I think really can help with that decision fatigue.
I couldn't agree more. And that's actually a really sophisticated perspective around this concept. Some of the low-hanging fruit that I've heard people talk about around decision fatigue is just looking at the decisions that you have to make every day on a regular basis and just removing either the requirement for a decision or the requirement for a comparison to be made for a decision to be made. And oftentimes we talk about people wearing the same thing every day, or using like routines.
And Obama, and
like I'm pretty much the same. Like I've got 20 of the same T-shirt, 5 of the same pair of jeans, 30 of the same pair of underwear, 30 of the same pair of socks, and every day I don't have to think. I just pull something off the shelf. But is that actually effective? Does that actually support when it comes to the decisions that I'm making, at 8:30 in the morning versus the decisions that I now have to make at 5:30 in the afternoon after a big day?
The research seems to suggest that it does, that the more we can remove that executive function from decisions that don't really matter. So, even things like meal planning can be a real burden for a lot of people. If we're able to get that, and some of those meal delivery systems are
bloody
pretty cool for that, in terms of making sure your diet's good as well as taking out that decision. But we do use executive function if we're making those sort of decisions, and if we're able to remove that from those sort of quotidian decisions that don't really matter, then it does free up some of that bandwidth to focus on the things that do.
I'd love to get back to the resilience shield. We've talked about number 1 is innate. And it's an internal. We talked about number 2, mind, and all the layers around the psychology. We talked about number 3, the body, and you touched on 3 important points. Diet, exercise. It wasn't hydration and sleep. The MVP. What are the other 3?
The other 3 are social, professional, and adaptation. So the social layer is massive, and this, if I'm honest with you, Kerwin, this is my area of weakness. It opens some really interesting questions about connectivity. I think there's a fantastic and really interesting ongoing dialogue about social media as an element of this. Where does it fit in? But it is talking about those enduring networks. And we really distinguish between the social connections we have within work and the social connections we have out of work. A lot of people, particularly high-performing people who are very dedicated to what they're doing in their job, they tend to not have too many mates, networks outside of work. And the litmus test we ask is that, if you or they were sacked tomorrow, would you have that ongoing relationship? And if the answer's no, then that's a professional friend. That's not contributing to what we call the social layer. And so what we're talking about here is having the ability to have meaningful relationships and get that kind of support from friends and family. Interestingly, our research distinguishes, and I wasn't attuned to this until we started really getting into the interrogation of the data from our resilience survey. But there is a distinction between building resilience and reducing vulnerability. I think I'd always thought they just operated inversely proportional.
Yeah.
But you can actually be relatively high in resilience, but still relatively vulnerable. And this is where the social layer really comes into it.
Wow.
If we have that human connection, then we're actually reducing the vulnerability, which is feelings of things like alienation and powerlessness and rigidity. Social connectivity helps to reduce that more than any other aspect of the resilience shield.
It's interesting, and I don't mean to cut you off, but
No.
In Stephen Kotler's work, he talked about I think it was the 6 or the 7 layers. Paul put that up again, of grit, and then I was inspired by that, and I came up with what I wrote. I created a presentation called the 14 Elements of Grit, and although Stephen didn't talk about this, it's one that you've just nailed right on the head, which is what I refer to as social grit. Because we are so aware of how we're becoming increasingly more aware through the research of how important social connections are. But for some of us, and I'm going to assume you maybe fall into that category, I'm an introvert. Like I'm an ambivert, so I can stand on stage and talk to 12,000 people. But if you put me in a room to speak to 4 people, I will be more nervous talking to 4 people that I don't know than 12,000 people that I don't. And I've discovered that although my desire is to move away from social connection, it actually was hindering me. It was affecting my my psychological capacity. It was affecting my emotional capacity. And then I started to go, well, but I don't want to socialize. And I was like, well, you have to, mate. Okay. And I know it's going to be hard, but we're going to have to do this because this is going to increase your performance as a parent. It's going to increase your performance as an entrepreneur. And so do you think for some of us, there is a level of grit that is required in order to be able to push ourselves out of our comfort zone to be able to create those social connections so that we can get that meaningful benefit?
Yes, I very much do. And I think the first thing is this is so individual. And the really big important thing about where we wanted to go with our model is there's no one size fits all for any of this, and this is why we have a resilience survey, which helps benchmark your individual resilience profile and gives you an idea where you might want to focus your efforts. And the second thing is it's not a competition. You don't need to say, oh, this person's got more stress than me, or I've got more resilience. Yeah. It's not about that. It's about yourself. So to answer your question, I think the first thing is understanding where we currently are. And you mentioned introversion, extroversion, this is part of the big 5 personality characteristics. Having an understanding of that, I think, is really important because it helps you understand how you're going to impact in these situations. Introverted people tend to need to recharge after social interaction. This doesn't mean they can't do it. It doesn't mean they can't go on stage. It doesn't mean they can't have meaningful relationships. But they recognize that potentially that's more draining than it might be for an extrovert who may draw energy out of those kind of things. So that understanding is really important. The second thing, and this is a really important distinction, is there's a difference between loneliness and solitude. I think solitude is a wonderful thing, and I'm naturally drawn to that.
Me too.
That doesn't mean I'm lonely. But to your point about social grit, I got to watch that I don't end up lonely, that I don't, because I like the solitude.
Yeah,
but I still recognize it's really important to have those human contact, the human relationship. And so for me, there's some wonderful, there's a lady called Tara Moore who relays a conversation she had with a rabbi talking about this concept of fear. And the rabbi says that English is a clumsy language. It only has one word for fear, whereas in Hebrew, there's 2 words. There's pahad, which is this reptilian saber-toothed tiger leaping at you, no shit, fight or flight fear. You want to listen to that. But our body interprets the second type of fear exactly the same way. And this type of fear, yira, is what the rabbi referred to as the fear you get when you're in a space that's bigger than you're used to inhabiting, when you're on the precipice of doing something new.
Oh, I
And this,
like
to me,
this.
I love
Oh,
this
that's
because
amazing.
this is a heuristic that you're in that growth mindset
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
You're doing a stretch goal.
And it's creating a positive frame around fear.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
this is the fear you want to lean into. You want to
Yes.
harness that yira. You don't want to
Distinguishing
run
fear.
away for it. And so on that social thing, I sometimes do find that, gee, I'd prefer not to do this, but I recognize that apprehension is out of, the wrong kind of fear, and I should be leaning into that because of all the positive benefits that can go from it.
I love that. I really, yeah, I can relate to that a lot. And I think that, as you said, there's a difference between loneliness and solitude. And it was interesting because I was at lunch a few months ago before the lockdown, and someone was asking me about meditation. And I was explaining how, and you've obviously done meditation, and you're probably familiar with Vipassana, the meditation where you go away for 10 days. And I explained that I'd done it 6.5 times. And she goes, so you've spent 60, almost 70 days by yourself, in quiet meditation? And I was like, yeah. She goes, that must have been really lonely. And I was like, wow. I said, actually, no, it's not. I said, well, I guess it could have been if you don't know yourself very well. Mm. And I think, because I think there would be some people going, well, what's the difference between loneliness and solitude? And I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, to me, it's about the choice.
Yeah.
I think loneliness is when you cannot find that
connection.
Kind of meaningful human connection, and solitude's more when you choose to deliberately remove yourself for it for positive benefits. There's an awesome book you've probably come across it, Tribe by Sebastian Junger.
Oh, I haven't read it though, but I've got it on my it's on my bookshelf at home, and I've had that many recs on it. I should read it.
Yeah, mate, it'll take you 2 hours to read, and I mean, it's through a military lens. He obviously spent a lot of time embedded with the US military, the whole Restrepo experience that he had. But I think he really nails this idea of kind of loneliness, even though we've got 1 million Facebook friends, we've got a bunch of connections on Instagram, we're living in an apartment building with 200 other people, within 50 meters of us. And yet, we can still feel lonely as a result. He really portrays that idea of belonging. And again, it comes back to that discussion we had about feeling part of something and kind of the initiation and the shared experience, shared hardship thing from a military context.
And that's an important part of performance, and if you look at, any research, Dan Pink, has put some great research together, especially around motivation and drive. And, he's got the great book, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Really Motivates Us. And he's looking at Csikszentmihalyi's work and Carol Dweck's work. But one of the things that he identified was purpose, the importance of, he identified the three most important things, which was, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But purpose being a part of something, being a part of a cause, being a part of a movement, something bigger than self. Yep. And again, that's what, when you look at SAS or SEALs, that's a big part of the initiation, is to become a part of something, a cause or a movement. Yep. So how do we, as entrepreneurs, as parents, as athletes, how do we use that as a way to enroll others in in what it is that we're trying to do? And what are some of the best ways that you've seen people enroll others into a cause or a purpose that ultimately will induce a higher level of performance?
This segues perfectly into the next layer, the professional layer, because this is a big part of what we're talking about in terms of professional resilience. Very much echoing Pink's sort of thoughts, we talk about these ideas of virtuosity, so mastery, but also purpose, having some sort of meaning. And there's a couple of different aspects here. One, I mean, ultimately, we would all love to find that job with meaning. And I use the throwaway line, we moved to the North Shore of Bali and start a surf school using recycled plastic surfboards and employing orphans, whatever it might be. Yep. That's fantastic, but it's not necessarily 100% feasible for all of us. And so we focus a lot on finding purpose in your job. So rather than finding that job with purpose, finding purpose in your job. And I think as a leader, it's really important to be able to bring that out. We talk about there needing to be a golden thread of logic between the ultimate organizational purpose, what we're saying on the front door of our company, but that needs to translate down into what people are doing day to day. They need to see that connection. And so the best companies, the best organizations that we've worked with, the purpose or the values or the ethos or the vision, whatever you want to call that sort of list of platitudes that we often find in corporate things. In the best companies, best organizations, these actually mean something. The leaders within that organization bring them to life. They seek every opportunity to demonstrate, what does integrity mean within this context? What does compassion mean? What does excellence mean? What does respect mean? All of these platitudinal words, if we're able to bring them to life and link them to what we're all about in a company, that can be a really powerful way of creating that purpose. And sometimes you have to look for it, but it's definitely worthwhile. I mean, this is where we transcend that kind of transactional relationship where we're just clocking in and getting our paycheck, towards inspiring people to believe that what we're doing does have meaning, does have purpose.
But you're also talking about the autonomous motivation that the programming that's required in many respects at a psychological level to provoke autonomous motivation. You know, because a lot of people are saying, oh, I just can't feel motivated. I need to read a book. I need to go to a seminar. And they say, well, how do you motivate yourself, Kerwin? I say, well, I fucking wake up. And I wake up that way. But that doesn't help someone, you know. And one of the things that I do, and it's a very, I guess you could say, gross example of what you were just referring to, is if I've got someone that wants to do something, and oftentimes what I find is, you know, money is very rarely in people's top 10 values. They think it is, but it's not. All you've got to do is look at their behaviors and their acquisition and their care towards it. In most cases, it's not. But oftentimes people want more money. But when it's not a value, how do you initiate a motivation to get and to have and to hold something that isn't a genuine value to you? You know, and this is my experience in business, because oftentimes I'm working with people in business and then trying to grow a business, and they're struggling to work out why they can't make more money, but they don't realize there's no value for money. And so one of the things that I've worked with people is creating these these linkages in the neurons, these neurological connections that, when they are laminated over time, provoke and trigger an automated response, which is a behavior that we're looking for. And I call it the Fortune 500 list. And I look at, okay, let's say your number one value is family, and it's demonstrated through your behaviors, it's through your activities, your discussions, and, you know, it's categoric, it's not social. But you want to have more money. So I get them to answer these questions. Okay, give me the 500 benefits to your family that making more money will give your family. Now, most people will normally tap out at 40, and then they'll push themselves to 60. And, you know, it's rare that I get someone to 500. In most cases, I can get someone about 120, 200 before something in their head just clicks. And all of a sudden, they find themselves wanting to do things that they've never done before, that as a natural consequence produce more leads, or as a natural consequence produce more sales, or as a natural consequence produce more productivity, which ultimately produces more revenue. Do you have any little hacks like that you use in order to... Because it's one thing to hype someone up to get them motivated, but it's another thing to give someone the gift of self-knowledge so that they can motivate themselves. How do you cross that barrier? How do you give people that?
One of the big ones that I think is really important is let's leverage off some of these natural mental heuristics that your brain wants to do. And a massive one is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is when you start becoming aware of something, all of a sudden your brain's attuned to it and you start seeing it more. So, you know, if you've just bought a Kia car or something, all of a sudden you're seeing Kias everywhere. And confirmation bias can be dangerous in decision-making. If you've come up with this fail-safe plan, this watertight concept, all you're going to be open to is information that confirms how smart you are and how your plan's on track. So it can be a negative thing, and we want to keep our minds open in that sense. But if we are aware of the kind of things that you're talking about, Kerwin, if we educate ourselves and refresh ourselves on the discussions about, well, what actually is important. And even for me, a really big one is this idea of being present in social interactions.
So true.
Because I'm increasingly aware of the importance of that, I'm now attuned to the opportunities that presents. So if I'm having that 5-minute conversation with a coworker, or that little bit of time with my kids before, you know, split between school and football practice and whatever, I'm more aware that this is a moment, this is an opportunity to do that thing I've been thinking or reading or talking about. So I think immersing yourself in these kind of things, reminding yourself of these things. And I love your idea of actually codifying what's important. And this is where journaling, I think, is such a really fantastic thing. You can reflect on, what is important, what you want to hit the next day, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've as a trite little example, there's a movement called Look Up, which I think is fantastic. It's about mindfulness and literally elevating your gaze from your screen and that. And I've been writing that down as a goal for each day. And, as I walk to work from the train station, I'm seeing incredible things in the architecture in the city. I'm getting eye contact and smiling at people randomly. These kind of things come about because I primed myself to look for the opportunities. So I'd leverage that confirmation bias that all of a sudden, hey, here's a chance to do that thing, to, in that case, look up or to be present or to get eye contact or whatever it is.
And last but not least, number 6, adaptation.
Adaptation is pretty cool. We call that the bonus layer. Essentially, you can get better, you can develop your resilience in a lot of domain-specific areas. And so the modifiable layers, we consider the mind, body, social, professional. These are ones you can actively work on, and you will improve them within yourself. And our thesis is that if you get a sort of well-rounded resilient shield in these levels, then essentially you're ready for the zombie apocalypse. You can leverage off that known and knowable stuff that you've done in the resilience space to meet any sort of novel challenge, that you have this essentially a resilient shield that can deflect pretty much anything that life throws at you. So it is about using those skills that you've developed and transferring them into that novel environment.
And it's such a critical one, especially during the times we're going through right now. There's a lot of world firsts, a lot of new worlds, a lot of old worlds that are colliding. And there are a lot of businesses, and we discovered this in our high end clients. When Corona hit, we were working with about 380 clients, and of those 380 clients, I think we only had 2 that shut down, but we had clients in industries that were being wiped out that were adapting and pivoting. And now having, record months, record quarters, record years to date in industries that were being completely wiped out. And so I just can't overemphasize the importance of that last one, which is that ability to be adaptable. Because when you are adaptable, there is no failure. There's just another decision that needs to be made. There's just another, there's more imagination that's required.
We had the most tangible, I talk a big game about the body layer. I do enjoy my coffee and I find it hard to go without. But the most tangible example in the early days of the lockdown were the 2 cafes that are closest to our house, and very different responses to things being shut down. Right. One of them basically just boarded up shops and essentially it was like a victimhood thing, like, woe is me, don't know what's going to happen, curl into the fetal position. The other one just fought. They did things like, doorfront delivery. They did things like, sort of remodeling and getting food in, and you could get your sort of staples from there in a touchless environment. They just fought with different models, different ideas, different concepts. And they were adapting what they had, recognizing that it was a coffee shop, but an important part of people's daily routine, and leveraging off the ability to provide other important parts of the daily routine. And they just never gave up. It was awesome. And they're going gangbusters now. The other ones.
I love that. And another great example, I don't know if you've heard of Sticky, the lolly shop in the Rocks. Did you hear about these guys? They went.
No, I haven't. I know the shop.
They went from a few $100,000 in revenue, and then everything shut down. And then they thought they were toast. And then the guy's daughter's like, well, let's just start doing TikTok videos of you making candy. And so anyway, it got picked up by Snoop Dogg. Snoop Dogg shared it, and they've now just turned over $1 million, which they've never even come close to. It's like 4 or 5 times their peak revenue, without a single walking past, without any walk traffic whatsoever. And their distribution model is now TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. And this was an organization that was literally completely governed by walk by traffic.
Yeah. And what I find so inspirational about we see that and we think, oh, well, yeah, switch to socials or whatever. That's not the point. The point is do something.
Do something, exactly. Don't just
roll
sit there.
over.
Yeah.
There's a Finnish concept called sisu, SISU, which is, there's no direct equivalent word, but it's like grit. It's like never give upness. And there was a Finnish guy who won the CrossFit Games in 2010, a bloke called Mikko Salo. And at the end of the last event was just this brutal sort of series of physical tests. And he finished and stayed on his feet. Everyone else is in bits. They're dry reaching, they're on their back, gasping for air. And the guy interviewing him said, how come you're not on the ground? And he said, I once read that when an animal gives up, it lies on its back. And he said, I vowed never to do that. This kind of idea, that no matter what, they've shut my coffee shop. I'm getting no foot traffic in my lolly shop, but I'm going to try something. I'm going to see if it works. And if it doesn't, I'll try something else, and I'll learn, and I'll progress, and I'll adapt.
Fucking love that. Ben Pronk, this has been an absolute treat for me. Our values are shared and aligned in so many different ways. You've just written the book, The Resilience Shield. Is that right? Has it just come out? Or has it been out?
It came out, 1st of August.
1st of August. Congratulations, mate.
Thank you.
I've been threatening to write a book for about 15 years now, so I know it takes a lot of work to actually get it done. Has it been a few years in the making?
Yeah, it has. It's really a codification of about 15 years worth of reflection,
and
then more recently the work we've been doing with corporate clients. But mate, it has been a fantastic process. Never go into business or write a book with your best mate and your brother, but notwithstanding that, it's been bloody brilliant.
Mate, I'll have to get myself a copy. If people would like to get themselves a copy of the book or find out more about you, where can they go? Yeah, and we'll put all these links in the footnotes.
Awesome. ResilienceShield.com is kind of ground zero for, we post a lot of our reflections through blogs there. There's links to being able to buy signed copies of the book, and a little bit more about the model there. And then we're on predominantly Instagram. I think we do have a TikTok account, but we don't.
And you have a podcast as well.
Yeah, so Tim Curtis, the co-author and my business partner, and I have been doing the Unforgiving 60 for a number of years, which has been really awesome. We like your show, it's such a privilege to speak to a wide variety of people doing really interesting things.
Fantastic. Ben, it's an honor and a pleasure. And if it's okay by you, this won't be our last conversation. I'd love to pick up this conversation at some point in the future.
Mate, I'm with you. I've really enjoyed the chat, and I think there's a bunch of areas we could chat.
There's a lot. We could talk for hours. Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to Unstoppable, and this has been Ben Pronk. This episode is brought to you by Nail It and Scale It, the world's leading fast growth program for businesses. If you have ever wanted to grow your business faster than what you can right now, if you need to make more revenue, if you need more leads, if you need more clients, if you need to know how to plan your business in a strategic way in order to hit big goals, if you need to learn how to scale your business and grow your team and your business so that you have more freedom, then this program is for you. Imagine 3 days immersed with me where we cover all aspects of business, but we do it from an immersive but also an execution standpoint. We execute every step of the way, and we're looking at 5 key areas. We're looking at your psychology, we're looking at your marketing, your sales, your leadership, and we're looking at your planning and how we integrate these 5 key areas to grow your business and your brand quickly. So if you'd like to find out more information, kerwinray.com.